Hey everyone, today I want to discuss a topic that we've never really addressed on this channel, meta builds. In Horizon, this term is broadly described as the concept of going against real-life build and tune philosophy and car choice to be faster in the game. Now on this channel and in my own gameplay, I focus largely on real-life tuning and building logic, but that does come with the knowledge that I could possibly be faster on leaderboards if I leaned into less realistic building and tuning. But why is that even the case? How come doing some things that would make your cars worse in real life makes them better in Horizon? Well, this video is gonna dive into that and explain the logic behind meta tuning. Not just saying, well, it's not a sim, so of course the tuning isn't real, but instead taking a deeper look into what game systems and aspects of the physics cause certain elements of meta builds, and what the future of the meta could look like if things change. Now before we begin, this is not a video against meta building. In fact, I think I'm defending it here. If you want to meta tune, this video will give you concrete reasons as to why it makes more sense. So let's start with the performance index and class system, or how the game determines how good your car is. The way Forza does this is simple but kind of strange. It simulates an AI driving your car around a sort of virtual test track that's a mashup of the roads in Horizon 5's map. This is how essentially all of your performance stats are calculated. It's also why you can see things like failed 0 to 60 times. If the AI driver maybe spins out or takes too long to hit 60, it just returns a failed time, even if the car can actually hit 60 miles per hour. It's a pretty decent system in theory because it does test every aspect of a car in a somewhat live environment instead of just pulling basic stats like power to weight. But it obviously has its problems, and a large part of building cars and meta tuning revolves around tricking the simulation into thinking your car is worse than it really is. There are two key elements to that: understanding that the AI doesn't drive like a real person, and that the system doesn't account for tuning. It's also important to realize here that this isn't how classing cars in real racing generally works either. In many racing disciplines in real life, there are absolutely overpowered cars, because things like a car's innate aerodynamics and handling ability can't easily be measured or restricted. And on top of that, things done to increase safety are rarely restricted for obvious reasons. It would be a bad idea, for example, to limit tire width and grip, but not limit horsepower, because that would be super dangerous. Real race regulations often restrict things like power and weight, or sometimes by drivetrain, or even just how much you've modded your car, entirely ignoring the base performance of the car itself. So real race cars often are absolute handling machines with incredible grip and downforce, but not that much horsepower, because handling is usually free and horsepower isn't. In Horizon though, cornering G-forces, downforce at various speeds, and more can be measured and factored into your performance. And safety isn't an issue. It's all about how fast you can get around the track. This is why we often see cars leaning more into power than handling. So there are some Horizon 5 meta build choices often considered unrealistic or uncommon in real racing because of this. Let's take one of the most popular offenders, all-wheel drive swaps, which while often very good, come with one major downside: understeer. The AI driver simulating your performance will get all that understeer, but you can just tune it out using methods like the 165 sway bars, which we'll cover a bit more later. Tuning plays no role in your car's class. The AI will always use the default tune, but you can tune out that understeer while keeping the advantages of all-wheel drive, and then, boom, you just made your car better without the game realizing. This also works for things like adjustable wings, which often lower PI because of the increased downforce slowing the car down, but you can just remove most of the added rear downforce in tuning. Same thing with thin front tires if you have adjustable front aero. You can turn up front downforce to compensate for lack of grip, but the AI can't. Now, when it comes to transmissions, most meta builds won't upgrade the clutch, because the best drivers drive in manual with clutch mode, which mitigates the effects of the upgrade. The AI drives a sort of automatic, where shift time upgrades still make a big difference. Sport transmissions are often preferred because the default gearing ratio it gives is usually slower on the simulated track than the car's stock gear ratio, leading to lower or similar PI. But of course, you can just tune the final drive to whatever you actually need. When it comes to big power upgrades or power builds, these work so well because the AI is terrified of spinning out and losing grip, and will do everything in its power to prevent that from happening. Because not only is drifting and proper countersteer actually pretty hard for the AI to do, if and when it does spin out, it usually has a hard time getting back on the road quickly. The pathing can get all sorts of messed up. So where the AI always plays it safe, real drivers can push the limits of grip much harder and utilize power more effectively. These are just some of the reasons why building a fast race car in-game doesn't really line up with building fast cars in the real world. Some of it is totally valid. For example, handling should be factored in and balanced against power in the game. And you shouldn't be forced to put a roll cage in your car just to keep your character safe in the event of a crash, for example. You know, sometimes it's okay to understand that this video game is just that, a game. It doesn't have to line up with the real world, and changes can be made for the sake of fun gameplay. But there is still an underlying debate. At what point is the existing PI system restricting us from building the types of cars we want to build? After all, if all the best builds use the same parts and methodologies, that doesn't leave room for fun buildcraft and experimentation. There is value in picking the right car and build for the event, but you should still have a healthy variety to choose from. Unfortunately, it's not an easy problem to solve entirely. There is no such thing as perfect balance, especially in a game like Horizon with hundreds of cars, mods, tuning adjustments, and so on. But that doesn't mean there aren't options. They could start to manually intervene with the system by attaching built-in costs to certain mods. You've probably heard a lot of people say things like, all-wheel drive swaps should cost more PI, or the bone shaker needs to be nerfed. But that's not as simple as it seems, and it means manually adjusting an automated system. It could get messy or lead to even worse problems if not done properly. So it's likely best to keep the system automated and thus consistent. So instead they could modify the simulated test track to more accurately reflect real driver performance. But the problem is, we only get one PI score for every type of racing. Tight circuit tracks use the same PI as high-speed sprints, and road and rally are judged on the same score as well. So really, if the same PI score is going to be used everywhere, the track needs to encompass everything. Any minor change to that simulated track or the AI that drives on it would drastically change the meta, for better or for worse. Ultimately, the most common method of rebalancing that I usually hear is to add tuning to the PI calculation. This would be theoretically simple to implement in a new title. Instead of just running the AI simulation with the default tune, run it whenever the tune is adjusted and recalculate PI based on that. In fact, Gran Turismo already does this, and it does work pretty well most of the time. If you, for example, turn up downforce or tweak the suspension alignment, the performance points reflect that. Not only does this help with game balance, it also gives the players a bit of a guide as to whether or not their tuning adjustments are making the car faster. This could solve things like all-wheel drive swaps being so powerful, or feeling forced to put on the Forza wing just for the PI drop. Now, it isn't perfect, and would absolutely have to be tweaked to work right in Horizon, and it brings up another big problem. It could make tuning much less valuable. Right now, good tunes are like installing secret upgrades. It's because tuning doesn't affect PI that makes it so important. So, how much of an advantage should a good tune really give? People make in-game careers out of building fast cars, and I mean, I've basically built my real YouTube career out of teaching people how to tune. So if tuning becomes less valuable, that could all change or go away completely, leaving a lot of people pretty upset. Now, let's talk quick about the act of meta tuning itself, not just the building. Things like running really low tire pressures, 165 ARBs, or fully locked differentials. This almost all comes down to one single physics tweak in Horizon's handling. You see, save for this one thing, the physics in Horizon are actually much more realistic than most people would think. Horizon does genuinely, realistically simulate just about everything a respectable sim does. Then, outside of softening some edges to make the driving experience more enjoyable and accessible in an open world, it really only tweaks one major thing: grip over the front tires. And this is where almost all meta tuning comes into play. See, in real life, your tires of course have a grip limit, and when you're braking, that costs grip. In fact, under anything more than light braking, it costs all your grip. Braking force exceeds tire grip force at any reasonable speed. That's why ABS exists, and why you'll lock up if you brake hard without it. Here's the problem. In a race, you also need to turn, and that costs grip. At speed, it costs all your grip. And if you run out, well, that's what understeer is. So if both braking and turning cost all your grip, you can't do both at the same time. So in real racing, you do most all of your braking in a straight line, then ease off when you start to turn. In an accessible open world game where people often play with Xbox controllers and even keyboards, it turns out a lot of players just want to brake and turn at the same time. So Horizon lets you. Braking grip budgets and turning grip budgets are somewhat split in Horizon's physics. If you do something that in real life would cause violent understeer because you're asking too much from the front tires, well, Horizon just lets you keep asking, and it keeps delivering that grip, propelling you faster and harder around the corner. Seriously, the vast majority of meta tuning all boils down to the game just letting you slow down and turn at the same time. So how does that get solved, if it is even a problem that needs solving? Well, you could change the physics, make them more realistic, but that completely defeats the beauty of what makes Horizon as fun and accessible as it is. It isn't a full simulator, and it's not trying to be. It's easier and often more fun to drive cars when they have some extra grip and you can whip them around corners. It also just kind of makes sense for an open world game with custom routes where you might just not know what type of corner is coming up next. In a game with its own physics, it's okay for it to have its own tuning. But again, like with the build problem, the problem here is more so that it restricts variety and experimentation. Settings like tire pressure, ARBs, differentials, and aero rarely change from one meta tune to the next, whereas others like alignment and damping are often much more diverse and driver specific, which I feel is a better use of the system. One solution to part of the issue, in my opinion, is to make front and all-wheel drive cars more prone to oversteer by default, instead of having to tune for it. This would likely increase its PI cost, as the AI wouldn't be understeering so much. For front and all-wheel drive, so much meta tuning goes into reducing that understeer as much as possible. So if instead you didn't have to do that, and instead had to focus on keeping the car stable like you do in rear-wheel drive, then we'd likely see some more variety in tuning setups, which ultimately is what I want to see in the game. Variety in tunes, builds, and car choices. Horizon 5 has made some good progress here, and more cars than ever feel useful and competitive online. There will always be a meta though, it's just the natural way of competitive gaming, but I'd love to see a refresh to the PI system, building, and tuning, so as to encourage a greater diversity of competitive cars, mod choices, and tuning setups, especially at Forza's highest levels. Now, I don't have a complete experience of the game. No one person can. These are all just my own thoughts and ramblings. So I would love to hear what you all think about this. Should tuning be a part of the performance index? How could the PI system be improved overall? How could tuning be improved? Or are any of these even problems that need solving in the first place? Maybe the system is at its best. Let me know what you think, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.